Greetings, Professor Haenfler, in the frameworks of an international and interdisciplinary project dedicated to the subculture. Could you share a little bit about yourself and your studies about subcultures?
Sure. First, thank you so much for inviting me. This is such a pleasure. I really appreciate it. So I'm a professor of sociology at Grinnell College in the state of Iowa, right in the middle of the US. And I came to study subcultures because I grew up in the punk rock scene. And I loved my time participating in subcultures, heavy metal. I was into a little bit of hip hop. And when I was in graduate school, I had the opportunity to take a different kind of a look at subcultures and learn something more about them in depth. So I was a participant, but then as I studied, I realized that subcultures were interesting places to study how people engage in resistance in their daily lives. So as a scholar, I'm especially interested in how do people engage in social change as part of diffuse networks. And so subcultures are often have a focus on some kind of resistance to a perceived mainstream society. So it makes it an ideal subject matter for me. So I tend to study especially punk rock, but also straight edge, which is a clean living branch of the punk rock movement that's been around 40 years and is now all over the world. And I study a variety of other things as well, but I'm especially interested in those music-based subcultures.
If we take a general look what kind of types of subculture it will be possible to list, in your opinion?
Yeah, and this depends a lot in how we think about subcultures. What is a subculture, which is a big discussion. But there are many music-based subcultures. Of course, as I've mentioned, punk, hip hop, goth. There are many subcultures around body modification, tattoo cultures, so-called modern primitive cultures, piercing cultures. There are subcultures organized around activities, skateboarding, custom car cultures. And then there are a lot of subcultures around some kind of cultural object like anime or otaku in Japan, Lolita. So most subcultures have all of those things or many of those things, but of course some have a particular focus that brings them together.
What approaches do you use to study subcultures? What are the obstacles in actual investigation on a certain subculture?
Right, so I tend to try to study a subculture over the long term and really stick with it in a longitudinal kind of a way. And that gives me the opportunity to use many different methods in order to have many different types of data. So for example, I do a lot of ethnographic work or participant observation. So I'll be right there in the punk concert or whatever at the straight edge show, right with all of the people, getting to know them, trying to experience what they're experiencing and taking field notes. But I also do a lot of in-depth interviews where I talk to participants for often an hour or more and then transcribe and code that data. I have done a little survey to get a little more quantitative data. One of the obstacles to doing a survey with subcultures is there usually is not a list of participants. You can't really do a random sample most of the time. But I still did a survey and gathered some data with straight edge people all over the world. I've also done content analysis of song lyrics. So creating a database of lyrics and then using software, to find different themes. And then of course, it's, I think, very difficult to study subcultures now without paying attention to social media. And so I am a member of many different Facebook groups. I follow many different people and groups on Instagram, and I log a lot of that information into my field notes as well. let's see, some of the challenges. Each of these has their own challenges, but I think in general, some of the challenges of studying subculture are gaining entree or access. So sometimes subculturists may be suspicious of outsiders for good reason in some ways. So that can be a challenge, just trying to find people that are willing to talk with you. I think related to that, there's a challenge of trying to represent the diversity in a subculture. So not everyone thinks the same, has the same experience. So trying to talk with many different people who are involved. That's a good challenge to take on. And then finally, one other thing that's a challenge is sometimes you find yourself trying to balance different loyalties. You know, when are you simply a researcher, but when are you part of a subculture community? How do you remain a critical insider if you're someone like me who identifies with the subculture that I study? So there are certainly challenges, but I like this approach that gives me many different sources of data that I can compare and contrast and cross-check. I think that gives me the most valid results.
Professor Haenfler, can I ask, are you a member of some subculture?
I am. So I still identify as straight edge. So not smoking, drinking, doing illegal drugs, and still maintain a vegan diet and all these other things that go along with that subculture. And I still consider myself a punk, even though I'm a professor at a college. I think I still have that punk rock mentality and spirit.
Okay, thank you for your answer. How do you think, because you are a member of some subculture, does it help you to study it, or maybe it makes some obstacles for you?
Right. I think both of those things are true. On the one hand, I have access to many, many, many different participants, and I have a certain kind of understanding of of the scene because I've been in it for so long. And so I think that's helpful. I can get online and write an email to straight edge people all over the world, and usually I'll get a response, especially because many of them have read some of my work. But of course, the challenge is you have to wonder, you have to be careful, because I'm so embedded in this scene, am I bringing my own preconceived ideas to my analysis? Are there things that I'm missing, or are there things that I'm misinterpreting? Am I not being critical enough? So some of the things I do to try to deal with that challenge is continually ask myself critical questions. If I see a pattern, I ask myself, is this really the pattern, or is this just what I'm seeing? I, of course, have my peers, other scholars, review my work and ask me challenging questions. And I think because I'm a little older than a lot of participants, and I'm in a very rural area, that I'm connected, but I'm not completely a part of the community in the way that others are. So it gives me a little bit of a distance. So I'm not, I think I can bring a critical perspective to it.
Based on your practice of studying different subcultures, what can you say about their structures? Is it usually a hierarchy? Do all subcultures have the same structure or not? What can you say about this?
Right. So again, I think how we think about structure and subculture depends on what we see as a subculture, how we conceptualize it. I tend to think of subcultures as less structured than other forms of collective behavior, for example, social movements or gangs or other things. They tend to have a more diffuse structure that's held together by a shared identity, by certain activities, whether it's music concerts or gatherings or message boards, websites, social media. Rarely is there, again, a list of members that are all paying dues to be part of the group. So there's of course, some kind of structure, but it's typically less formal. And that makes it kind of a challenge, to think about what are the boundaries of a subculture. But I think that diffuse nature is an important part of it. On the other hand, the one thing I would say about structure and that kind of relates to hierarchy is that, like any social group, there's always some kind of a hierarchy. It's just that it's usually less formal in a subculture. So there's not a group of punks that elect a punk president. There's not like the queen of goth or the prime minister of hip hop. Nevertheless, there are some people who achieve certain kind of status, in a scene that maybe gives them more influence, more notoriety. So there's often a hierarchy, but it's not a formal hierarchy.
So we can say that different subcultures have different hierarchy, right? Or maybe they have some certain model and it differs by some aspects.
Right, and this goes back to one of the kind of classic ideas from Sarah Thornton's work of subcultural capital. So there are certain practices, objects, experiences that are valued in each subculture. And if one can claim, have some connection to those things that are valued, one has more subcultural capital and typically higher status in the scene. But that depends on the group, absolutely.
How do you think, what pushes one to become a part of a subculture?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. When people originally started studying deviance and deviant subcultures, they wanted the answer to this question in order to stop people from becoming part of subcultures, because subcultures were seen as dangerous or unproductive, potentially causing some kind of unrest. We don't really think of subcultures typically in that way in most of the scholarship now. So we recognize that a lot of different things bring people to subcultures. Many people want some kind of a leisure activity. There's something fun about it. They get something fun out of it. Others get a deep sense of community that they're missing, in other aspects of their lives. So a subculture can become almost like a family in some ways. Many participants have some kind of dissatisfaction with mainstream society. And so they may want to be part of a group or a network that pushes back and resists society and tries to live in a different kind of a way. That's very attractive to a lot of people. The sense that mainstream society is corrupt or crushes our creativity, and that we can form a network to do something different that's more fulfilling. I think that's a big draw. Some people experience marginalization, judgment from their parents, religious communities, peers, and a subculture can feel like a safe space. So there's all these different things that draw people into subcultures. I think the one thing that maybe many of them have in common is that usually, like almost any group, you become involved with it because you know someone who's involved with it, or you've connected with someone online. So social networks are a big part of participation. Who do you know? Who invites you? Who welcomes you? How do you get access?
Thank you for your answer. In what ways subcultures shape and change a personality?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question because as a sociologist, rarely do I even talk about personality. It's not really a concept that I use much. I have some background in psychology as well, but usually I don't think about personality. I'm more likely to talk about someone's sense of self. How do we think about ourselves? How do we create kind of a coherent story or narrative about who we are, who we hope to be? And subcultures are often places where people can really experiment and explore parts of their identity, parts of their sense of self in a way that they may have less freedom to do, in other contexts. And this is part of what's very exciting, I think, for many participants. If people feel like the dominant social expectations aren't a good fit for them, they feel, that they don't fit in some way. Here's a collection of people that probably feel something similar, and together can explore, who are we? Who do we hope to be? So I think that people can get some positive reinforcement for who they are and who they hope to be, their sense of self, from participating in subcultures. I don't think that there's any particular personality type of people that gets involved in subcultures, and I don't think subcultures necessarily radically shape our personality, but they kind of serve as a free space where we can explore who we are.
Subcultures that you have studied, how do they perceive the idea of death?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'm not sure a lot of the subcultures I study really make death or thinking about death the center of their subcultural activity, but there are some. I don't study Goth directly, but I've read a lot of work about Goth. And so this is one of those subcultures with a fascination for death and the macabre and the so-called darker aspects of our existence, right? I don't want to stereotype here because Goth people aren't all walking around feeling depressed or obsessed with death. But it is this space where people can express a certain fascination with some of these taboo topics. And in many societies, especially many Western societies, there's a taboo around death. So Goth is certainly one of those. Heavy metal is another. So some of the extreme metal scenes, including death metal, have a fascination with death and the body and horror. So their perception of death is often very provocative, using the fear of death and the fear of violence in a provocative way in their music and their culture. So that's two examples, I think, of groups that have some thoughts about death anyway.
Thank you for your answer. Professor Haenfler, you say it in your website, in your page of the website of your university, that you study people who do not perceive themselves as activists, but at the same time, when they become the part of some subculture, they do something. So they like active people. Can you share a little bit more about this research, maybe some results of this research?
Yes, absolutely. So I am also, I think, in many ways an activist. And I remember, especially when I was younger, going to large demonstrations, committing some kind of civil disobedience or direct action, and thinking, oh, this is how people make social change. You fight against the state, against the government, against corporations. But I recognized after a while that there were relatively few people that participate in this kind of activism. Of course, there are many people who do participate. We have many social movements in probably nearly every country going on all the time. But there are a lot of people who I think want a different world, but don't consider themselves activists. So this led to my fundamental research question, which is, how do people participate in social change through their daily lives? What are they doing when they're not on the front lines, on the barricades, fighting the police, or demonstrating, trying to shut down a city? And so that led me, again, to think about, well, there are certain subcultures where people are trying to change the world in some way, but it's in a somewhat more private way rather than public. It's in somewhat more of an individualistic way, even though there's a collective of people doing it, rather than like a social movement where there's often an organization. And it was often, this kind of resistance is often targeting culture rather than like the political system or a policy change. So for example, in my study of straight edge, there are some people who are interested in straight edge punk just as a leisure activity, and they're not using drugs and alcohol, but they're just into the music. But when I talk with them, many of them say that they are abstaining from alcohol and drugs and tobacco, both for their personal health and well-being, but also to resist alcohol and tobacco companies and to resist this culture that expects many young people to use alcohol uncritically. So that to me says there's also an outward focus. They're changing something in their life, but they're thinking that if enough of us do this together, we can create a space where we push back against this culture that we don't like. And likewise, for many straight edge people, they adopt vegetarian or vegan diets. And yes, maybe this is in some ways for health benefits, but it's also something that they're doing in their daily life to resist the factory farming, the industrial food production, and the culture of eating meat that, from their perception, from their point of view, is against animal rights. So that's some of the results that I find, is that there are many people who maybe aren't holding a sign or participating in a public demonstration, but have this understanding that what they do in their lives matters, and that they can help shift a culture and create new possibilities, new ways of living through their example and through inviting others to participate as well. So the concept that I've come up around this is called a lifestyle movement. And it's the ways that people engage in social change primarily through changing themselves.
You said very interesting things, and if I understood right, we can say that these subcultures that you described, they have some certain main idea. For example, the one subculture has the idea of the clean life. Can you please share your opinion about is it true that every subculture organized around the certain idea?
Yeah, that's another fantastic question and a challenging question. So subcultures, like the concept of culture, it's very difficult to define in a meaningful way. And we certainly don't want to think of culture or subculture as sort of this fixed, static kind of box of ideas and practices that then comes into conflict with other boxes of ideas and practices. So that's not it at all. There's a lot of diversity of opinion, of practice in any subculture. So nevertheless, there is some shared understanding and some basis of commonality around which people organize and join and then discuss. So this is why it gets so incredibly difficult to define something like punk. What is punk? Of course, that has many different meanings for many different people. We can see that through their interactions over time, certain themes may emerge, but again, you can't say these are the characteristics of punk rock. We can just see that there are certain themes that emerge that then people adhere to or change or resist. So in the case of punk rock, things like the DIY or do-it-yourself kind of mentality, trying to separate from profit-based corporate, capitalist ways of being. But of course, many punks are all engaged with capitalism in some way. So DIY may emerge as kind of an ideal, but there are going to be many different ways that people live out that ideal. And the same is true, I think, of just about any subculture. There's enough of a sense of commonality that people can recognize themselves and their understanding in others. We have got some kind of shared meaning, but then they're still going to argue about those meanings. I'm the real punk. No, I'm the real punk.
Would you agree with the statement that in today's world, almost every citizen of the planet belongs to a certain subculture without actually realizing it?
Once again, I think it depends on what is a subculture? What are we talking about here? And it's important to remember that subculture is just a concept. It's just a word, an idea. It's not something that's set in stone that we can say, this is definitely a subculture, this is definitely not. It's a tool. The concept is a tool of analysis. And I conceptualize subcultures, I think, maybe a bit differently than the popular understanding of subcultures. For me, subculture does not mean simply a subgroup, like a smaller social group in a larger society or culture. If we think of the concept in that way, almost everything could be a subculture, and therefore nothing is a subculture. There's no way to use the tool effectively to understand and analyze social life. So I see subcultures as relatively diffuse networks of people who share some kind of an identity, share some kind of meaning around ideas, objects, practices, but then also feel some sense of marginalization from society or resistance to some aspect of what they see as conventional society. Those 2 points are really important for me. Now, others may disagree, but for me, this is part of the way I conceptualize subcultures, some kind of marginalization or resistance, in addition to some kind of difference, from the rest of society. So maybe an example might be useful here. Football players aren't necessarily a subculture. They've got fame, fortune, play a very popular sport that a lot of other people play. And likewise, not every football supporter is in a subculture either. They may be just quote unquote regular people. However, some of the most hardcore football supporters, the so-called hooligans or ultras, they may constitute a subculture. It may be useful to bring our analytical tools to the study of those groups because they have some sense of marginalization, resistance, and difference, significant difference from other groups. So to return to your question, is everyone a part of a subculture and they just don't know it? Not necessarily. I think many people are somehow a part of a subculture and have been impacted by subcultures, but no, not everyone is engaged in some kind of resistance or feels the kind of marginalization and shared identity that comes along with being in a subculture.
Professor Haenfler, I don't have any more questions. Thank you very much that you found the time to make this interview.
Great, thank you.